I have the very distinct pleasure of talking to you about one of the most exciting, yet one of the most taboo topics there is, sex. I don't know, for some of you, you may be like, yeah, sex. And then some of you may be like, oh, sex. Do we really need to talk about this in a public place? And I get it. We seem to have a real love-hate relationship in our society with sex. With so many contradictions. It's something that's supposed to be so amazing, yet it's so taboo. And it's plastered everywhere, and it's used to sell everything. But it just kind of makes us feel bad sometimes, and we want to protect our children from it. And some people even say, why are we even talking about this? This is such a trivial topic. Why talk about it? Why research it? It's just a physical act. Just like the animals. These are bonobos here. And really, we do look an awful lot like them when we have sex. Although most of us don't kind of have that third person standing over us watching. Which brings me to the theme of the TEDx Women Conference here, the space between, which is so perfect for sexuality because there's such extremes when you look at that. For me, the space between represents this place for beauty and awe and inspiration and transcendence and vulnerability and authenticity, acceptance and bliss. Well, we don't often talk about it that way. We don't often talk about the complexity of sexuality, and what happens when we don't talk about it is that sexuality ends up in the shadows. And that's where we have shame and embarrassment and exploitation and abuse and fear. And we learn this. We're trained to think this way. Now, sure, there's absolutely physical and physiological components of sex that are universal, but so many components and experiences and beliefs around our sex and sexuality are learned in the culture that we are grown up in. And that changes from culture to culture. And unfortunately, for many women and young women and female sexuality, the message that gets programmed into our brain is around doubt and fear. That's what gets put into our mind. So I'm going to briefly walk you through kind of the state of sexual affairs around women's sexuality, and then imagine how it could be different. So the first messages we often get are fear. This is a virus, and that's what we learned. STDs, STIs, the fear-based aspect of sexuality, which is really important to talk about, absolutely important, but it's not balanced with the other side, which is also the pleasure. Or women's anatomy. You know, we learn about it, but I knew it in high school in Pennsylvania where I grew up. We never learned about the clitoris. I didn't know that existed, and I only come to find out later it's just the seat of pleasure for many women and the sole part of human anatomy for pleasure. That would have been nice to know. And then, if you're a woman and you're learning about your body and sexuality from some politicians and health leaders out there, you'll learn that our uterus and ovaries have magic powers to shut down the reproductive process during a legitimate rape. And I do agree, it's pretty magical, right? Women's reproductive powers, our sexuality, really amazing and magical, but that's a little ridiculous. So what if we talked about sex as a normal, natural part of being a human, which it is, and we talked openly about it and frankly about it, and that instead of just even talking about the clitoris, we celebrated the clitoris. Now, this is Mulva, and she is my talking vulva puppet. And she is really excited about having a clitoris, and she celebrates it. And what if we looked at the choice of pregnancy as a beautiful thing, and the choice not to be pregnant as a beautiful thing also? But we don't. What majority of young women grow up with in our society is this good girl ideology. And it's strong. And I know, I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania. I heard this loud and clear from society around me. Look a certain way, dress a certain way, be pretty, don't talk too loud, follow the rules. Sex is bad, it's scary, it's embarrassing, it's something to avoid, don't touch yourself. Be responsible, don't take risks. Now, overall, not all of those messages are bad, but when they combine together, for young women in development of their sexuality, there's not a whole lot of space for sex positivity. There's a lot of space for fear. And what that leads to for many young women is just such a heavy shame and embarrassment around anything sexual, thoughts of sexual or being sexual. Or it leads to alienation and confusion. And I heard a woman shared with me that when she got her first period, she thought she was dying. Which makes sense. You're suddenly bleeding. And no one prepared her for that. And she didn't know that was a natural, normal part of being a woman. And then we've got the aspect in the home space of just abuse, and that there's so much silence around that. And by the time young women get to middle school and high school, their sexual reputation is such a powerful thing, and often something they don't even have control over. It's defined by others. And with the advent of cyberbullying, we've all heard that the terrible consequence that for some youth is suicide. That's how powerful shame is, and that's how powerful sexual shame is. And our social institutions seem to be dysfunctional when it comes to female sexuality. From our family, to government, to schools, to religion. And there's such a heavy aspect of fear and control around it. And the funny thing with this is, it's presented to us, these barriers, that they're there to protect us. And that's rather ironic, because the way they end up playing out is that it's a lot of shame, and then that leads to silence. And like I said in the beginning with the space between, in the realm of sexuality particularly, anything that's not talked about, that's silent, ends up living in the shadows. And how this shows up in my work, when I work with individuals and couples, is women coming in that are unhappy with their sex life, dissatisfied, disconnected, resentful of their partners, have never had an orgasm, just don't know how to be in touch with themselves and don't know how to be vulnerable, and they think they're broken. And for many women, it's like they're in a box and they don't know how to get out of it. But what if young women learned to be confident and powerful and to enjoy their bodies, know their bodies, and talk about it? What if we learned that masturbation was a normal, natural thing? And that it's okay to explore ourselves and experience that pleasure, and that we actually consider that honoring ourselves? And what if we learn that it's okay to be vulnerable and open up to a partner and trust someone else and go to that place to trust our intuition and trust our reading of others? Which brings us back to the brain and what we've learned and how we've been trained. We can know all these messages, and we can know that we don't like them or that they insult our soul, but we can't necessarily know what to do about that because they're programmed into us so deeply from such a young age. And I believe we literally need to break chains. It's as if they are chains tying us together inside of us. And if we can figure out how to break those chains and choose to replace it with something else, choose to replace it with peace instead of fear. And I believe that the key to doing this is mindfulness. And mindfulness as a concept is being aware in the moment without judging what shows up. That's an important second part of that. So it's the idea that the past has already happened, the future hasn't happened yet, and all we have is right now, this moment. And what is it to be present in this moment and have compassion for yourself with whatever shows up? And I know for many of this is really hard because we've got a constant mind chatter going. Even as I was saying that, you're like, this moment, wait, what does she mean? It's this constant mind chatter going on. And for many of us, it's our thoughts. It's as if our thoughts have thoughts. And they just layer on top of each other. And for women in the sexual realm, these tend to be pretty negative. Judging ourselves, thinking we're not doing enough, that we need to perform better. Or the always ubiquitous, I'm too fat, right? That shows up everywhere, unfortunately. We tend to get swept away by our emotions and thoughts as if we have no control over our reactions. What building mindfulness does for us is it gives us the ability to stand back, and it gives us the ability to respond instead of react. And we can learn how to stand back and stand on the shore, not get swept away by it. And this gives us choice. Now, the best tool, the most profound yet simple tool I know how to apply this and start learning this is this mindfulness triangle. So in any moment, if you had an automatic pattern, a predetermined programming that you don't like, that's not serving you, you want to change, I suggest that you look at 3 different components of that. The thoughts, the emotions, and the sensations that are going on for you. Now, this happens so fast, right? If we're programmed to something, it happens immediately, and they just feed off of each other as if we can't do it any other way. But when you can slow down and take a little space and give yourself that space to sit with your thoughts in that moment and say they could be, I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, they don't like me, I'm not pretty enough. Or your emotions. We've talked of shame and fear and disappointment, disillusionment. Or sensations, and by that I mean bodily sensations of everything from that feeling you've been punched in the gut to butterflies to anxiety in your chest or constriction in your throat or a lightheaded feeling, your heart pounding, your blood pressure rising, feeling warm. All of those things, so much body wisdom, so much wisdom that our body has for us. But we don't like it often because it's really uncomfortable. And when we can choose in the moment, even just to take a few seconds, to sit with what shows up in our thoughts, our emotions, and sensations, and have compassion for what shows up, and not judge it, and also choose not to run from it, to hide from it, to distract, or to numb ourselves. When we choose to do that, we take our power back, because now we have choices. So let me give you an application of this. I'm going to apply it to an actual body and give you an example. I worked with a young woman. She was in her mid-20s, single, identified as heterosexual, raised in a very religious household. She was dating because she wanted, emotional closeness to men, but had never experienced an orgasm, didn't really even experience desire or arousal. And she came to me to work with me. And so I asked her to sit with the thoughts and ideas of her as a sexual woman. And I asked her to work the triangle around that. And what she came up with first were emotions. And it was shame, and it was embarrassment, and it was fear, and it was guilt, and it was some sadness. And then it was also mixed with some yearning of wanting to connect with men, wanting to feel valued that way. And then she moved into the thoughts. And her thoughts were, oh my God, if my family knew I was having sex before I was married, what would they think of me? And it was not trusting herself. And it was also sort of this distrust of men. And she just didn't know how to be herself. And we moved her into the sensations then, because this is where the depth of this process often unfolds for people. And her sensations showed up as this constriction in her throat. And it was this tightness in her chest, and I asked her to describe it even more. She said it was like a black ball in her chest, and it was just weighing her down. And just by the process of her describing that in detail for the first time and not judging herself, by choosing to sit with it, it started to open some space for her to start to forgive herself, which then over time opened the space for her to start making healthier choices in who she was dating, which then opened the space for her to find a wonderful new boyfriend and to actually experience depths of sexual pleasure in a new way, which then opened the space for her to realize that she had been having orgasms and she just didn't know it because she wasn't able to be aware of what was happening in the moment and with her body. This is a difficult process. It's tough to settle into these things that we want to run from. And I had a client that came in once. And I said, how you doing? And she's like, I hate the triangle. I'm like, you hate the triangle? How can you hate the triangle? Everybody loves the triangle. I'm like, why do you hate it? And she's like, because it hurts so much. And I said, I know. That means you're doing it right when it hurts like that. And it literally can feel like you're on the cliff, ready to go over the edge, as if the world's dropped out from beneath you. But with shame and embarrassment and guilt, they will get a little bit worse before they get better because you're choosing not to run from them for the first time. But I guarantee when you sit with that and you feel with it and you drop into it and you know that you're not going to die, that's when you no longer have to be afraid of it. And that's where you have taken your power back and you can make new choices about what you're going to do with that. And I guarantee there are rewards ahead if you choose to sit with this process. And it may seem scary, and you may not want to, so if the rewards seem too far out and you want some sooner than later, I do want to remind you that in terms of working the triangle, that there's a whole nother way you can work your triangle to make sure that you're taking care of yourself. So I'm going to leave you with a thought that I pulled from Eve Ensler, who's a world-renowned playwright of the play The Vagina Monologues. And she asked the question, if your vagina could talk, what would it say? And I used to think this was it was a fun question, but it was just really trivial and kind of silly. And I have realized that there was such a poignancy in this question because we need to talk for our sexuality. As women, we need to bring that voice up. So, in conclusion, I brought Mulva to speak to you today. And this is what she has to say. Read my lips. Please practice mindfulness. I am not your enemy. Work with me. And when we can come from that place of inner strength and connect with others from that place of strength, that's where we really have the power to deprogram ourselves and to make a change. And so I ask you to consider, how will you choose to fill your mind? Thank you.